the Countryside Podcasts with Chris Skinner. Hello, it's that time of the week again where we get great big gulps of fresh air. The Countryside Podcast with Rat Skinner and his faithful sidekick, Chris Skinner. Farmer Chris, here on High Ash. Well, he's a bit boisterous this morning.
You're telling me? I don't think I'm going to get a word or a bark in edgeways this morning. He's hugely excited to see you arrive at the farm because he knows he's coming out on the farm. And he's not much of a sheepdog because let me just pick him up. Come here, I'll pick you up. Because the sheep, which are behind us, are moving away from us. Understandably, they can deal with collies, but not demented terriers.
They've wintered here just outside Norwich, haven't they, on your land?
Yes.
And they're heading off soon.
They are. They're mule crossers, and they've just been scanned at the end of the field to check whether they're in lamb or not, and also how many lambs they have. And there's 182%, which means that most of them have twins, which is incredible. There's one set of triplets in there, one set of quads, so one of the ewes are going to have 4 lambs, and the rest are a mixture between one and twins. But 182% is a really good lambing percentage. They're mule crossers with one of the exotic French breeds, so they're quite large, very healthy. So they've been providing a service for me, which is grazing off all the hay fields. Besides, you can see they've done a fantastic job.
Looks
here.
a lovely light colour, doesn't it?
Yes, it's even shorter than this public footpath we're standing on, which goes right through the middle of the farm. So they've grazed it off, and that will now tiller out. And so instead of 4 or 5 stems of grass coming from one plant, you can get 10 or a dozen. It's sort of chopping the head off. It's called perpetual spring, and so you get a really good hay crop after it. And they're now on the pollen and nectar fields, and this is their very last field. So they've been here, I think we introduced you to them way back in October, I think, when we first looked at them. But they're all of them pregnant. I don't think there's any barren ones in there, which is quite extraordinary. This field is a long-established pollen and nectar field, and it's been down since 2006. And it's a delight for me because there are 2 new species of orchids, one of which are called bee orchids. And on this field alone, which is 24 acres, that's about 10 hectares here that we're looking at.
Yeah, it's a big field.
It is pretty big, isn't it? It's quite a way over to the far side of it. There was getting on for 8,000 bee orchids on here over the whole field. How or where they've come from, I don't know. But the delight last year and the year before was right on the peak of the hill, which is really heavy yellow clay with lots of chalk in it. Remember, we got chalk underneath the whole farm. We had pyramidal orchids as well. Oh, they were so beautiful. That's the county flower of the Isle of Wight, and each pyramidal orchid, just one flower can produce 10,000 odd seeds just from one flower, and so I'm delighted. So this year, hopefully there'll be more. It's right by one of the public footpaths on the farm here, and I've been busy over the last couple of weeks sort of diversifying a bit because
Oh my word, you've got a new bench here.
yes, just further down the hill, Matthew, was a venerable old oak tree that got struck by lightning. And sadly, because it's right by the footpath, some of the big limbs high up in the canopy had started to drop off. And I was always a bit anxious that people walk here, sunshine, rain, wind, snow, everything. So the farm is kind of open 24/7, 365 days a year. And I was always anxious that somebody would get clonked on the head, and because I knew the tree was past its best, to say the least, the limbs were dropping off, I had to fell it. But I chopped it off 6 feet high, and somebody very clever with a chainsaw has made an owl sculpture out of it. Not too... I'd rather have the oak tree, if I'm honest, but nevertheless, attracts a lot of interest, and at the base of the tree are 2 hares, and it's done really, really well, I must say. They're very lifelike, but higher up the trunk, and this is part of the trunk that we're standing next to.
This is more your sort of woodwork,
This is
isn't it?
yes, it's good solid piece of oak. This one's about 7 feet long, and you can sit on it. I have dried that part of the seat, and if you just sit down for a second, we can kind of contemplate Norfolk.
It looks wet to me.
That does look a bit. I'll let you off. Sorry. I've had wet trousers since the word go, I can promise you.
It's a great viewpoint up here, isn't it? Because actually you're high up.
So this is a really high spot. You've got a panoramic view, which is why...
And right behind you, you've got the 2 big transmitters that I think originally were radar in the Second World War.
They certainly were. Believe it or not, there were wooden pylons there with huge tops on, and I can remember looking out my bedroom window in the farmhouse just sort of wondering what they were. They were absolutely huge, and they were replaced in the 1960s with the galvanised pylons which are there today. So a little bit of history. If you turn round, you can see Norwich's southern bypass with all the heavy lorries going on, and there's Norwich to the north of the farm, only a mile or so away, very close to the city, and it's gradually spreading out in all directions apart from the south direction, which is where we are. We've got a lot of archaeology here, and that's helped prevent this sort of spread over the countryside, and that's where one of my interests lies. We've got lots and lots of question always about how farming has changed, what the history was like here, and where we're sitting, where I'm sitting rather, and you're standing, everything around this, I can remember it's being ploughed, but by horses. And that's a transition. So in the porch, the entrance to where I live, I've kept some of the horse memorabilia to remind me every day of the hard work of those animals. It was proper horsepower then. There were teesmen here to work the horses. They would start work early in the morning, sort of 4 o'clock, feed the horses before they'd go out on the farm. There'd be a blacksmith at the bottom of the village there, down near the Caister Crossroads. The smithy was there, so if you lost one of the shoes, and they aren't like horseshoes today, these were huge. They were 8-9 inches across them, huge great lumps of metal.
Well, these heavy horses, they're glorious beasts, aren't
Yes.
they? So noble, and there were many millions of them years ago.
Yes, and they did all the work, which is where the word horsepower comes from, I suppose. So a lot of history here, and it's almost tearful to realise how much work went on. There were 31 employees at the farm when I was born, and just at the bottom of the valley here, at the end of this footpath, there were 3 farm cottages which got demolished. They became redundant. In about 1975, they were knocked down, and there was a schoolroom on the end of it. And every Friday evening on my trip back from school, on my bike, Brackendale, I had to cycle to school, I would collect the rent from the last farm worker that occupied those cottages. And his name was Mr. Vincent. His wife was Kathleen, and she'd wait at the entrance to the cottages. No electricity on there, no phone, no water. There was a well in the garden, and they lived there quite happily. His wife was Kathleen. He was a farm worker on the farm, and Kathleen would hand me a little envelope, which I gave to my father, and that was the cottage rent for the week. 2 and 6pence. 12.5 pence in today's money. You can't believe this. And that was hard for them to pay that. And yet they had to pay the rent. And Arthur Vincent, in his latter years, became a gardener at the farmhouse where I was born. It's a walled garden. He was absolutely excellent. But I knew when he was there because even when I walked up the farmyard with my bike coming back from school, there'd be a strong smell of tobacco. And he would have a pipe, and it would be on the go the whole time, hanging out the corner of his mouth. And he smoked the most aromatic tobacco that you can imagine. It was called County Shag. It was it was foul stuff, and some of the farm workers actually chewed it. And it was a chewing tobacco as well, and quite disgusting.
Well, this is like an alien world now, isn't it? In your lifetime,
yes.
It's become so alien to our experience.
It has changed so hugely. And this is, I was farming virtually the whole of this farm single-handed in the early 2000s with the modern equipment. The combine wouldn't go down the road. You had to take the header off it. And yet, in my childhood, the binders were just tiny. Oh, wow, look at that. Skylark. It's just mounting, come up off the ground.
He doesn't like the look of us, does he?
No, it's almost overhead. And of course we're on this high spot, there's sandy gravel, and it's singing, and it's quite cold today.
What a joyful sound
Yes.
for early in February.
Yes, it's gone up, it's 150 feet and it's still rising, almost on the same spot. 180 feet, way up now, a tiny dot in the sky.
The way the cloud is today and the light, I don't think I've seen a skylark that clearly before.
No, it's beautiful, isn't it? And the song. So this is the area, which is good. The sheep are going in the end of the week, and they're already setting up pairs. At this time of the year, we actually have flocks of skylarks because it's a red list species now. It's one of those species that were protected in 1981 by the Town and Countryside Planning Act, and also the Wildlife Act as well came in at the same time, protecting not just birds but wildflowers and animals as well. Hugely important, and again that's all part of the history of the change of the countryside over my lifetime. I've had my 70 years and 10, and I'm in my 5th year of what's called grace now. so
Well, you're pretty active, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I'm radioactive, I tell you. Yes. So there we are. So a little bit of history of this side of the farm. We're just going to do the same thing on the other side of the farm. Then we're going to look for some, yes, moment of madness, some spring wildflowers. But just before I go, I've got a special thank you, because last week's podcast, we asked for some help in funding this series of podcasts, and all I need to do is to say thank you for everybody who donated to help Matthew and me and Daniel, my son, put it all together.
Any cash left over goes to help the conservation efforts you
and
do
does
here.
things like this wet, lovely oak seat, but I've sited it on the north side of the tree, right beside us. And so on hot sunny days, when you make it to the top of this hill, you can sit down, pour yourself a cup of tea, and it's heaven.
The ducks at High Ash Farm going in to roost for an evening. Hey everyone, it's Matthew here, and if you've been enjoying our countryside podcasts, we've got a small favour to ask.
Yes, Matthew. What we're going to do is to ask for a small donation to help run the podcast, and any surplus goes for conservation at High Ash Farm here. And so it's really important. We both love to keep the podcast going, and that duck agrees with me, I think.
Well, it's straightforward to donate. You can make a one-off donation or set up a small monthly contribution, and the address is highashfarm.com/podcast.
We're hugely grateful for any support. It means we can keep sharing the stories of the countryside, which I love doing each week, but it's that small amount of costs we need to cover. So thank you very much in advance.
Just on the way to our next location, and right against the skyline there, hares.
Yes, Matthew, I've been watching this all week, and the hares at High Ash don't realise that it's not March yet, but they've gone mad already. The old motto, Mad March hares.
There were 3 or 4 of them on the horizon there.
And what's happened is some of the females have come into estrus, into heat. They give birth at this time of the year, funnily enough, leverets, and there's lots of cover here for them, so very popular destination. And the jack hares, that's the male at this time of the year, relentlessly chase the females in order to mate with them, and if the female doesn't kind of feel like it, shall we say, then she'll stand up on her back legs and kind of box back at him, and that's one of the sights in the Norfolk countryside to really, enjoy. It's so typical of the behaviour that goes on, but it does happen in daylight as well. The males have testosterone coursing round in their bloodstream, and it kind of invigorates them, and they carry on like that, and you do have to just smile when you see it.
To see them silhouetted there on this
Yes.
fairly bright day on this upward slope against the sky, it was
Yes.
just a classic shape of the English countryside.
Absolutely, and that's what I try and foster here at the farm. And anyway, we're on our way to the next location, and nearly there, another sort of few hundred yards, and we'll have another quick sit down.
What is that, Chris?
Somebody must be in there photographing the hares. That's a camouflage. So, yes, I didn't know they were here. And you see it's open here. We've got sort of permissive paths all over. I had no idea.
A little camouflage
Little
tent.
camouflage
It's like a
tent
hide.
with the camera lens coming out of the front. And I expect whoever it is in there has got some lovely shots of those hares, because they were in the perfect position. Yes, there's lots happens here, wildlife or with human behaviour, that I have no idea about. So there we are, a little surprise. Perfect little seat, completely camouflaged. Wow.
Well, here we are, next to Fox's Grove.
Yes.
And another brand new wooden bench. That actually, there's a creature been on top there.
There has. It's not rat, but somebody's been sitting here with their dog beside them, and the dog forgot to wipe its feet. So there's a few paw prints. It's one of the lovely ash trees that sadly fell over in Fox's Grove here, heavily infected from the roots upwards with ash dieback disease, and you can see the root of the fungus going up the trunk from the roots there, and it's a 8-foot bench right at the top of another hill. So we've come about 3/4 of a mile to another hilltop on the farm. The farm is a series of hills and valleys. And again, this is really interesting. There's a lot of history here. This field is called Elm Bank. And as a young man, there was a row of huge elm trees across the middle of the field, going right across the farm, right to the farm itself, several hundred of them. And of course, they all succumbed to Dutch elm disease. And the elms in this area of woodland of Fox's Grove were so thick, so close together, and so huge, you couldn't actually walk between them. It was kind of like equatorial jungle. And of course, it was a wonderful playground for me, and I might come down with my sisters occasionally if we were allowed.
What a wildlife haven as well.
It certainly was, and home to lots of species of butterfly, black hair streak butterflies and things like that, which are now incredibly scarce. So Rat's ventured off into the woodland. He's sitting near the rabbit warren over there. But another piece of history here, because it's light, sandy soil, everything you can see from that horizon to that horizon, it's a huge area, is High Ash Farm. It's absolutely massive. And in the early 2000s, just over 20 years ago, the farm profit each year, I was growing commodities. I was growing wheat, 1,000 tons of cereals each year, and 2,500 tons of sugar beet. And both the cereals and the sugar all became what was known back then with the wine lakes, the butter mountains. They all became known as commodities, and they could be got and were bought in from really anywhere in the world. And because this is light, sandy soil under where we are at the moment, the farm became unprofitable. And early in the 2000s, the profit went down, so that one year in particular, I broke even. That sounds quite good in farming terms, to break even, but it was time to make a change because a lot of the soils in East Anglia, when you go down to Breckland, they're often sandy, poor soils. You can get some good wheatland down in South Norfolk, and so it's hard for people to imagine how much soil dependent or crop dependent on soil type actually is, and it has a huge influence. On these south sandy slopes, the winter barley could grow here. In June, if you got a few hot days, it just died on its feet, and of course that had a huge impact on the rest of the farm. It put pressure on all the other systems. So eventually 2006 higher level stewardship came along, and there's so many options in it, and I decided to go for the whole lot, including permissive access, and it was almost a tearful day. A beautiful, huge combine, which wouldn't fit even a little bit of it down the small country roads, that went. The plough went. 4 tractors went. The sugar beet harvester went. The sugar beet drill, all the sugar beet equipment went, and I cleared the whole lot out and took stewardship on, professionally, if you like.
Stewardship for wildlife,
yes,
and preserving the landscape.
Yes, preserving the landscape, water harvesting as well. So a lot of the farm went down to grassland. And so it's another one of those huge changes which came right back to 1947, which is the Farm Tenancy Act, where it provided tenants with 3 generations of security. So my son Daniel is the 3rd generation, because a lot of the land that we farm here is tenanted. So you're always very vulnerable, because farm rents are expensive compared to the income from the farm. So a lot of changes, but the changes are happening all the way round. Just south of us, there's a massive planning application from the A140 right across to the A146. That's about 8 miles between the 2 roads, for a huge solar farm. There's already 1 or 2, and that's really good wheatland. There's already a large solar complex just on the south side of Norwich, Trose there. I'm very aware of all the changes. And right across Norfolk, from the wind farms up on the North Norfolk coast, or just off the coast, there's a huge tract of land being taken at the moment to bring the power to right beside where we're standing, to Dunstan here, for a big substation, and that some will be underground, but a majority of it will be on a new set of pylons.
150 foot tall, I read.
Some of them, Matthew, absolutely huge. And the station just at Dunstan, right close to where we're standing, will transfer the electricity from DC, which comes as direct current, which comes from the wind farm, to AC, and then another set of pylons from where we will be able to see them, heading straight down to Tilbury on London outskirts, to take the power down to London. And that's the whole thing over my lifetime here at the farm. There's been some massive changes. As a farmer, you have to kind of plan ahead. Quite usually I'd be thinking of the crops I'd be growing in 4 or 5 years' time. So I still have that mentality in my head, if you like, and just a massive amount of changes. So Rat's barking, he's seen somebody on a horse just walking past, and so that's one of the changes. But the next part of the podcast is back to what we normally do, and we're going to be finding some spring flowers.
Sky seems full of rooks today, doesn't it? And crows of all sorts of descriptions.
Yes, we're booming, not with bitterns, but with corvids. Thousands of them.
They all disappeared off.
Yes, they're all flown off just as we arrived. And so this is the end of the season, really, for overwinter wild bird seed mix. And it's all died down now. So just as we drove in, there was a Chinese water deer right in front of us, and it's gradually dropping down by the week, but there's a green cover underneath, which is lots of grasses now coming into flower, some of them annual meadowgrass I can see, and there's also some early spring wildflowers which I promised to do at the end of the podcast. So we've returned to our normal regime of kind of following the seasons through and enjoying what each season has to offer. So technically it's still winter, but some of these you will find in the spring, and because there's been so much cover over the top of each of the wildflowers we're now going to visit, it's just, Gudgin, mind where you put your feet.
Oh, I nearly trod on what you're going to talk about there.
You did.
Sorry.
So what's happened is it's kind of microclimate down there, and it's encouraged some of the plants which would normally flower in March, next month in other words, and beyond that, but because it's warm, we're quite close to a hedge and an old oak tree covered in ivy there, so it's protected these plants a little bit. And if I go down on my hands and knees, the ground's a little bit wet, you can actually see we have flowers. There we are. They're tiny.
That survived my size 11s.
It did, yes, without being squashed. Right, a few weeks back I took you into one of the areas of woodland and we looked at one of the viola species, which was the violet, Viola odorata, meant to be the most perfumed of all British wildflowers. And this is a close cousin, which you will know about. It's called a pansy, and this is wild pansy, Viola arvensis.
Exquisite little flowers.
Yes. Look, and we have both species. There are 13 species of violets and pansies in the UK, and we have the two pansies growing here at the farm. This is the field pansy, if you like, and there's also another one which grows on the horse pastures called Viola tricolor, which has three little colours on the petals. You get two petals facing upwards, two out to the sides which look like ears, and then the bottom one which has a little honey guide on it. So if I just carefully tease this one off the stem and you look down at the bottom of the flower petal, can you see some little stripes?
About half a dozen stripes, isn't there?
Little tiny black stripes, and that's to guide moths and bees in to the nectary at the bottom of it. So there is a diminutive little one, but nevertheless all our garden pansies, some of them are quite huge, all been bred, all with those purples and yellows, some of them are blue, some pure yellow. They've all been bred up from the parentage of this, the wild pansy. It's also, the pansy itself is also called heartsease, and there is an estate, because it favours light, sandy, drought-stricken soil quite often. There is an estate on the sort of northeast side of Norwich called the Heartsease Estate, because when the houses were all built there were this particular plant, the wild pansy and the field pansy, growing all over it.
It was heathland originally, wasn't it?
It certainly was, yes, and quite close to that. We've still got one of the heaths there, which are all sandy and sort of almost like sea dunes, really, and that's called Mousehold Heath, all up in the same sort of area of the city, and really interesting plant regime growing there. But nevertheless, if you keep your eyes out at this time of the year, it's surprising. And a lot of the viola species and pansy species have lots of mentions in literature, and because of one of my study books for doing GCEs back at school in the 1960s was Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare, I think it was Oberon that picked wild pansies and squeezed the juice of them into the eyes of just trying to think, Titania, that's right. And so when she woke up, she would fall in love with Bottom, because it was kind of an amusing scene. And so I always remember this plant, because if plants were mentioned in sort of botany at school, then I would always prick my ears up and get interested. And often the comments would be, Skinner, the blackboard is inside the classroom, not outside the window, so pay attention. I was always getting told off.
He hasn't changed.
So that's one of them, the wild pansy and field pansy, Viola arvensis. Now, the next one's quite amusing, just a few steps up. Also in flower, and this one's a lot taller. It's about 8-9 inches tall, and it's called groundsel. And
Sorry, groundsel.
groundsel, Groundsel, groundsel. It's close relation to ragwort. Ragwort sort of flowers. It's one of the poisonous weeds in pastures, particularly for horses. That flowers in July and even into August, again on light sandy soil. And this plant gets its name because it's called ground swallower. And any gardener knows if you have a patch of bare ground, it will quickly get colonised in the first year by plants like this, because it's also producing seed as well as flowering. You can see the little flowers are bright yellow in clusters, quite sort of diminutive really. Each flower head is a little bit bigger than a match head, I suppose. And then this bit gives this its scientific name called Senecio arvensis. So if you can see arvensis in a Latin name, it usually means field. So these little white hares sort of fly off rather like dandelions and land here, there and everywhere. And so Senecio also means old man in Latin. But when you pull out the little hairs and let them fly off into the wind like that, you can see that one disappeared.
It's like an old man's beard, isn't it?
Exactly. This is where the old man comes in, because Senecio just means old man, really. But when you take off the little hairs like that, you're left, which is quite amusing, with a bald-headed gentleman, still with the little hair follicles in it.
Who are you looking at?
No, my eyes are very firmly fixed on there, but my voice is trying not to laugh. So there we are. So it's groundsel, it's ground swallower, and those little seeds are hugely important because it's one of the favourite foods. Remember, some of our birds eat seeds at this time of the year. We're already getting to the end of what's called the hungry gap, which is the time of year where you don't get many seeds growing out in the countryside, and groundsel provides food, those little seeds that flew off in the wind just then, rather like a dandelion clock, if you like, but much smaller. They feed one of our most beautiful finch birds, and we've got little charms of them all over the farm here, and they're called goldfinches. Right, take this little stake out. Let's just walk on to the next one. Yes, so it's surprising what you can see. We're only doing a few places up the edge of the field here, and we've already found two interesting ones. Rat's in the truck already. I don't blame him.
He's saying, what the heck are you doing?
Yes, and just look here. This is an accidental one. It's not a wildflower one, but little scrape in the soil. It's called a seat. That's the form for a hare.
That's quite big, actually.
Yes, it is. Yes,
and they'll just sit down there in the day.
That's right. The haunches go in the back, and it's scraped out a bit of soil. And we got lots and lots of hares out. We actually did, and you helped me, to do a hare survey in a previous podcast here. And I think the farm is host to between 65 and 70 hares.
That would be for a big jack, wouldn't it?
Yes, jack. So haunch back down the ground. Remember, they're quite large mammals, and with a bit of the vegetation around it, which is still there, that large animal becomes invisible and beautiful.
Remember, hares don't burrow underground, they live above all the time.
That's right. Born above ground, spend their entire life. Another little tiny white light flowers. Look at that, absolutely wonderful. It's a crucifer. That means each one of those little flowers, not much bigger than a pinhead, has 4 petals on it. So crucifer, crucifix, of 4 sides of it. So that's the family it belongs to. It's in flower, and it's recognisable instantly to me. It's one of the first ones I had to learn about at college. Remember, there's a bit of guilt in me talking about these, because I was trained to kill them all and decide which chemical to use to get rid of them. So slightly embarrassed, but it shows the leopard can change his spots, and now I love it because it's got a lovely name. It's called shepherd's purse. And take one of the little seed heads off, and it's also called mother's heart.
Perfect little triangular shapes, aren't they?
Yes, heart-shaped seeds.
Like an old-fashioned purse.
Yes, that farm workers and country-dwelling people would have a little leather thong round their waist and a sort of heart-shaped purse suspended from it. to have whatever money they had or whatever was important.
To have the 2 and 6 in, so when the farmer's son came along, they had to give it over.
To collect the rent for a week's rent for the cottage. So it's 10 shillings a month in old money, 50p a month for the cottage rent. That's how things have changed, boy, they say.
Was it 1,500 quid now, that will be, wouldn't
That
it?
certainly would be. Look at that. So beautiful little flowers already forming seed, and the seeds are quite wonderful. They're minute little seeds in those little purse-shaped seed cups, in gold colour as well. So there we are. Just one more to do here.
Those little white flowers, shepherd's purse.
Yes, shepherd's purse. It's got a rare country cousin as well, which is now a red list species, which is it's called shepherd's needle, and that's a registered plant, and we have that growing. Just look over there, 2 Chinese water deer just skirting across the field next to us.
Just bounding there,
Yeah,
aren't
it's
they?
bounding. You can always tell Chinese water deer, every third or fourth steps, they kick their hind legs way up in the air, above the height of their body. It looks really strange, so they're sort of like a kangaroo bound.
I do that on a night out.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yes. Look here, Matthew. In flower, pink flowers, red dead nettle. There we are. Finished off our little collection this morning.
A little bit of colour.
Yes, sort of deep, sort of mauvey pink colour.
And there's a blue flower
Yes,
over there.
we did that one a couple of podcasts ago. That's Speedwell, or Speedywell. Well done. Yeah, you're good. You're picking it up. You'll be able to do one of these podcasts all on your own.
Oh, I shouldn't think so.
They're very long. Look, right beside it, there is a Speedwell. Common field speedwell. Again, look, we're in the first week of February almost still, and we're finding spring flowers with the greatest of ease. So just shows if you can look, observe, know where to look, know when to look, it always lifts the spirits, and it's made me smile this morning, covering a little bit of the history of the farm. And these little fellows have been here for thousands of years, and that's the important thing about the environment. It's the living heritage which belongs to all of us.
We have emails. It's a windy day, so I suggest we repair to your vehicle.
Yes.
So we can read some of the messages.
And Rat's touring the hedge over there behind us, just using his nose. Look at that. Good boy. Come on, look at that. Talk about an obedient terrier. There, well done, Rat.
Out of the wind we are now. Although it's not a cold morning. We've had some frost the last few mornings, but
Yes, and it was beautifully sunny before you arrived, and then the cloud layer came over, but it warmed up. That's the important thing. It's about +4 at the moment.
Russell lives in New Zealand. He's a dairy farmer, and he's written us a lovely note about his farm in Manawatu, and describing some of the wildlife as well. He says there's plenty in common, even though we're opposite ends of the earth, and he enjoys your reminiscences about your father, who
Yes.
also farmed in New Zealand.
Yes, and he grew a crop which makes my hair curl, because he had merino sheep down there, close to Hawke's Bay, down in New Zealand there, on the other side of the world, England of the South it was called. It's got a very similar climate to here in the UK. And down there he grew fat hen, which is quite drought resistant, and to feed the sheep on during the winter months at the opposite end of the year to our winter. And he was there for 15 years, no less. So he was very well acquainted. I got some wonderful photographs of the farm and the merino sheep down there, which were mainly for wool back then. It's a very high value product. And yes, so Russell is absolutely amazing to get correspondence from the other side of the world.
He mentioned some of the plants, oxeye daisy, and also red clover, and the fact that the butterflies really enjoy some of the conservation he's doing there. He also liked your story about the documents that his father would pin around the fireplace, the invoices
Yes.
for work rendered?
Oh, goodness. It just brings back a memory. There'd be 2 candlesticks above the fireplace, and any bills that were due, and some of them were overdue as well, I must say, were pinned behind these candlesticks, and that was the entire filing system for the farm back then.
Jack Sheridan is a listener in Leamington Spa, and he says, "Hi Chris, listening to you talking about magpies made me ask, the other evening around 4 in the afternoon, I counted at least 30 magpies in the trees near my home. I assumed, like starlings, they were flocking together to pair off."
Yes, they communally roost at this time of the year, as I mentioned, and then in the next few weeks they're all paired off and they will find their own territories, which is why I don't control them, because they are hugely territorial. And one thing they don't like is other magpies, even close relations, nesting close to them, and they will destroy other magpies' nests. So there we are. That's why I let nature kind of do all the work for me.
Christine Oakley enjoys the podcast, and it's lovely to have you on board, Christine. This week you were talking about badgers and mentioned the culling related to TB. In the summer, I watched a BBC programme about the work of Sir Brian May, the Queen guitarist, no less. His research has suggested the possibility TB may be spread from cow to cow through their faeces, and the culling of the badgers is completely unnecessary. Do you have a view?
I certainly do have a view, and it's one of the aspects that's worried me right from the start of badger culling many years ago. And there are certain areas of the countryside in the UK where badger culling is allowed, although they're a protected species. It's the sort of hallmark species for the Wildlife Trust. It's what appears on the front of all their logos. So Britain's original landowners, if you like, that's the badger. And it's something that has worried me hugely, because bovines or cows that are infected with TB, sometimes you have what are called single suckle herds, and they can give birth outside. The afterbirth drops on the ground, and a badger would certainly find that as top-notch food and get infected if the cow was carrying TB. So sometimes transmission of tuberculosis, which is really difficult disease to deal with, happens in reverse, and certainly the bovines can infect the badgers can then infect each other, and we have such a lovely set here at the farm with 15 badgers in one of the sets, and I've become very protective of them, so I hope that culling doesn't extend to this part of East Anglia, but it is a hugely worrying, and I don't think badgers are the only species that can transmit TB either between themselves or reinfecting cattle or cattle infecting badgers. It can happen in any which way by several species of mammals.
The email address is chris@highashfarm.com. We love getting your messages. They're all read, and we try and mention as many of them on the programme as possible. And a big thank you to all our donors as well, helping keep the podcast going and also contributing to the conservation work that Chris oversees here on this square mile of Norfolk countryside. Chris, looking forward already to next week.
Yes, we'll do it all again, but completely differently, if that makes sense. Look forward to it. And Rat will be along here. He's sitting on my lap, and already he gets so excited when he knows you're coming up the farmyard. He's uncontrollable, as usual.